Hi, I'm Rose Alcock, founder of VHRS, as well as a proud wife and mother of 2 boys. Exploring the depths of people practices is one of my greatest passions, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the HR Insider series. This podcast offers a behind-the-scenes look at the work we do in HR, the challenges we navigate, and meaningful one-on-one conversations with colleagues from our industry. Together, we'll uncover what HR is truly about. We are here to share insights, stories, and inspiration with you. Let's dive in. Hi, Carryn. It's lovely to have you here today.
Thanks. It's great to be on board.
Yes, I think I mentioned to you earlier that when I read what you do, visited your website as well, I found it was such an interesting angle. We were just saying, and obviously you're going to introduce yourself now, but, does it fall into HR? Does it not fall into HR? I feel like, it's so relevant, the work that you do for just kind of general enhancement, of like teamwork, also individual work, and it does relate to the workplace. It goes even further than that. But yeah, I definitely think it's going to be an interesting conversation because it's something that is relevant in my conversations. However, I've never seen someone that kind of uses it as a focus. So I'm really going to enjoy hearing, exactly what is that you do. But before we go into that, it's really all about getting to know you, your background in HR, or, your educational background, and then how you got into the workplace. Maybe also how you got into doing what you do, in particular. I would love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks, Rose. And again, thanks for having me on the call. I have a bit of a checkered career background, but I started off studying organizational psychology at UCT. And while I was studying at UCT, I worked as a receptionist at what is now considered Virgin Active in South Africa, and would have been the Health and Racket Club back then. I'm giving my age away. And what I realized is that I wanted to work in a place where people had a good time. And so I went in Cape Town, that kind of, after studying and going overseas for a bit, that ends up being in hospitality. And recognizing that then in hospitality, how do I make the people who are in hospitality have enough of a good time so that they can impact the guests? And that's where I found myself moving into the human resources space. So my first foray into HR was actually in a hotel in Cape Town called the 12 Apostles, where I was just the HR admin person. And then I deviated a little bit and went into event management for about 7 or 8 years. And I traveled around Southern and Eastern Africa, leading large groups of incentive travel, large incentive travel groups. Got to travel 5-star style with other people paying for it and having some incredible experiences. But all dealing with people and all recognizing that this is around incentives and communication and how do people feel motivated. And travel is considered one of the highest motivators besides time with their family. Actually, travel was one of the biggest motivators in the HR world, in the people space. And from there, recognizing that actually I wanted to get into either professional or personal development, and went and studied coaching at the Graduate School of Business at UCT. That was in 2013, 2014. And in that time, I volunteered with TEDx Cape Town, and initially just helping them with the event, and realizing that my true passion was how do people get their ideas across from the stage? Because that's where the real impact comes in. So from 2013, 2014, I kind of dabbled in as a volunteer speaker coach, went to all of their speaker workshops, learned how all of that works. And over the next 7 or 8 years, I think between 2014 and 2020, worked in professional development, worked as the COO at a leadership consultancy, did some work in the NGO world, in the PR world. I was very fortunate to be able to take a break to study, and in that time really explore different career options. And so from 2014 to 2020, I did a lot of volunteer work with TEDx Cape Town, helping them with speaking and communication and getting ideas out onto stage. In 2018, I did my own TEDx talk, which I can tell you is scary, is very scary. But it's also scary being the coach and watching your clients on stage, because you have very little control once they get out there. And then realizing with my team, I obviously did some facilitation while I was working in leadership, and realizing with my team that it's all about how people communicate ideas. And during 2020, the leadership development consultancy closed. Well, it didn't close. It shifted into a far more individualized process. So we closed the main office and I was retrenched. And from 2021 until now, I've been running my business as the great presentation coach. And it's kind of gone from strength to strength. I also do work as head of culture at an organization called the What Food Group. For those of you in Cape Town, that's Truth Coffee. And I can tell you that's the best coffee in Cape Town. So I balance working in the HR field and in the presentation communication space, which I find for me balances things beautifully and allows me to learn a lot about how culture and communication are completely intertwined.
So fascinating. I think that what you're obviously an advocate of what you do because your communication skills are amazing. You really managed to intertwine in terms of one experience to the other, what led to it, and it's fascinating. I mean, you obviously have explored areas of passion, areas of strengths of yours in terms of how you kind of apply yourself to the workplace and what you do. So that's wonderful to see. And also really interesting because you mentioned, I mean, you come from HR, you went into hospitality. That finding that you had in hospitality in terms of you're serving a very happy client, right? Because people are on holiday, and then how actually do you translate that into the people that are kind of client facing in that industry to kind of connect at that same level of you need to be happy and provide a kind of good service and understanding that kind of needs kind of training, awareness. And so I love that connection that you made, because I often say it to my husband as well. There's industries where there could be formal industries, very established traditional industries that almost have a way of working, right? Think of oil and gas, and you're kind of very old and established type of businesses. There's other industries that they just have obviously tech, right? Everything is startup, scale up, chaotic, and the whole thing. So definitely choosing the industry that you want to work with, if for one to be conscientious of that, not only the company, but the industry that you want to work in, especially when you have roles like HR, which you can apply to any industry, it's so important. And also really interesting what you mentioned in terms of you obviously work for very high-end brands. I mean, 12 Apostles, that gave you exposure to the best in hospitality, and then you're working. So it's really lovely to see that how you were able to kind of tie aspects of you adding value, getting that type of exposure, and then obviously pouring it all in what you're currently doing it, right?
Thanks,
Right?
Rose. Yeah. Thanks. I think yes, it's been a long road to get to where I am, but my passion here is seeing people stand up, feeling grounded in their communication. And that is a skill that is important everywhere. If I'm thinking about when I did my coaching course, I'm a different human being to who I was before I started that coaching course. Being able to have a difficult conversation with a customer, with a client, with a boss, with a junior, all of that is about how do I hold myself as a human, and how do I communicate what I want to while respecting their space as well. And that's not that different to standing up and delivering a presentation, right? You've got to do all of the hard work beforehand to make sure that the message you want to land is there and is available, that the message, that the information that the person receiving it is going to that they're going to get the information that they're looking for. But more importantly, that when you stand up in front of that person, more importantly, when you stand up to deliver that you are okay as a human. The moment we get into any kind of stress-inducing situations, and some of the situations that your team in hospitality get put into are incredibly stressful. The customer is not always right. The people are irrational, particularly when they have very high expectations. And when if the person behind the desk or serving the customer reacts in a way that is unprofessional, it just escalates things. And it's the same in the corporate world. In the presentation world, what's fascinating for me with culture is that in some organizations, the person who's being presented to feels comfortable just interrupting and asking questions and kind of throwing off the presenter. And that situation is hard to deal with, particularly if you're junior. You really have to keep yourself calm and keep yourself grounded. It's also if you're delivering work and suddenly your entire audience switches off, that is incredibly hard to deal with as well. How do you make sure that you can bring them back in? Or alternatively, that you realize, right, actually, I need to end this conversation now because no one is taking in the information. So that awareness of self and awareness of others, that is a universal skill. And in the work that I do with corporates and their communication, the first thing I speak about is how do I set myself up for communication success, as opposed to the content or the room or anything else.
I hear you. I find it super interesting, really. I'd love to hear from you a little bit more in terms of how can an organization approach the presentations and meetings in a way that, because it influences the culture and also the internal communication dynamics. So a little bit maybe in terms of when clients connect with you, what is their needs, what do you walk them through? I'd love to hear about that.
No problem. So in my world, culture is communication and communication is culture. Culture is about how we treat each other, what we say, what words we use. And mostly when I'm contacted by clients in the corporate world, what they say to me is, we do a lot of meetings and a lot of presentations, but my people aren't getting the message across. Or they're just so boring, or can you help them feel more confident? Or how do they tell stories rather than just give me the information? So most of the time, my contacts are coming in from people who are being presented to. And what is fascinating is that if I look at people who present and communicate well, those are the people who are more likely to get promoted in their organization. No matter how good or bad your ideas are, if you can't communicate it properly, then you're not going to get noticed. And I feel very proud of the people who've been on my programs, and I hear about them having been promoted a couple of years later because I would have heard of their dreams. And I do get nice little goosebumps when that happens. So a lot of organizations, they just have meetings. Let's just have a meeting. Let's have a meeting. Let's set up a committee. I kind of want to get involved in government every now and then, but then I don't. But let's set up this, let's set up that. I mean, one business that I work with, I swear to you, 70 to 80% of their time is spent preparing for presentations. And no decision gets made without 1, 2, 3, or 4 presentations. So I'm being asked to help the people delivering those presentations actually get to the meat of the journey, and also not feel insecure sharing either good or bad information, but sharing it in a neutral way. Another thing that I'm often asked to do is, how can you make this more entertaining and interesting to hold our attention? Another thing that happens often is people are like, I have to bring down how many slides I have. They will only let me have 10 slides. And it's not about the slides. It's not about the number of slides. It's about how the slides complement the work. So again, we then talk about how do we structure the conversation, and how do we use visual aids to enhance as opposed to rely on those visual aids. So that's kind of how I come in. A conversation that I had with someone yesterday, they're in a pharmaceutical, actually it was this morning, they were in a pharmaceutical company, and they've got 90 minutes to tell their sales team about 14 different products, right? That's a lot of products in 14 minutes. And so we went and we structured it. So it's actually about the lifespan of a person, and how can each of the 14 products help that person at different times of wellness and illness and health maintenance, rather than here's a list of products that you have to learn. So we story it, we structure it, and that helps the person presenting because they remember the story. It helps the people listening in because they go, okay, at this point I can offer that medication. So that's the kind of work that I do. And people generally seem to enjoy the results of it. And I my first time I did my course was in 2021. And I still speak to those people, and I know that they still use a lot of the way that we did the work.
Yeah, I hear you. I find so interesting because I can now see the link in terms of the work that you do now with the personal coaching, because it does speak to personal branding. And I guess, the way you communicate represents you. I'm very well aware because, I mean, it happens to a lot of people in South Africa where English is not your native language. And I think what that does is become more aware of your communication skills, because you need to make sure messages come across and you're not getting lost in translation. And I guess, also, speaking about cultures, that's another fascinating aspect in terms of like language, right? And how different cultures, what they kind of bring to the table, what they put emphasis on and things like that. But yeah, I can see how, because it's a little bit of a hot topic in terms of that personal branding and how you represent yourself and your communication skills. I find that, I don't know if it is maybe because we are inclined, like we both studied, psychology or HR, organizational psychology, that maybe we are more inclined to think of the way we speak and how, brain processes and things like that. But it does seem to be the case that it's not something that everybody goes like on about their lives and aware of this. As you said, someone that starts a career and has works in a professional workplace, but it wouldn't be something that's on top of mind. So I can definitely see how you come into a picture and help people become aware of the importance of it. I was even listening to this podcast. It was a behavioral scientist speaking about cues. And that's when, all about like body language, facial expressions, the way we dress, the science around color, a lot of things that were extremely interesting. And the most interesting part was that it actually influences outcomes in terms of if you want to achieve something.
100%.
100%. It's so interesting to me because it's a tool in your tool set. And what they were saying as well is that you can be pretty bad at it, but the moment you become aware of it and you start putting protocols in place or you start trying different things, they will lead you to an outcome. So there's definitely a science behind it, which is extremely reassuring. and I guess, it's like, to me, such a like practical way to again achieve outcomes, because the way I see it is that when we look at you look at communication, and you said communication for you, it's almost like very intertwined, and it's
100% intertwined,
very related to culture in a business. The way I also see it is that why you would want to work on it, enhance it, and be aware of it, it's obviously personal gains like career growth, but also because it will change your behavior, right? Like the way you see the world, the way you kind of like position yourself, and that will have hard outcomes. And that to me is like quite mind-blowing, to be honest.
Yeah. Absolutely. Rose, every time someone goes into a meeting, how does each team start their meeting? Do you go straight into the details? Do you have some kind of connection? How is the decision maker in a meeting? Are we clear on who a decision maker is? Are we clear on what outcomes we're looking for from that specific meeting? There are a lot of, you can do a lot of research on different meeting styles and meeting approaches. And part of the challenge here is that it's got to be consistent, right? And so if an organization is consistent in how they hold their meetings, then that will impact their culture. And of course, within organizations, particularly large ones, each team can have their own meeting culture, their own meeting approach. I have worked with one organization where in their meeting culture, they would just arrive. They wouldn't really talk to each other, particularly because everyone was very, very scared of the boss. And if he was in that meeting and that was who's being presented to, and they would sit in their chair around a boardroom and they would all look at the screen and nod each other. And the person who was presenting would look at their laptop and click, 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 and speak through the slides. And then the boss or the person would be like, okay, thank you for the information, stand up and walk out. So there's no connection in there. The speaker didn't know how well they were doing. And when I started working with them, that was their approach. And it was hard to get buy-in from everyone, but I ended up getting them to stand up and deliver their message so that they were delivering a message as opposed to just speaking through slides. It's two different things. It's two different experiences. And in the end, and in the final session of my time with them, the boss ended up coming in, the managing director ended up coming in, and their final presentation, they have the option of what to do, but most of them chose to speak about a career highlight for them. So something that is a career highlight that impacts their work at that organization today. And what was magic was afterwards, he shared his most challenging experience in his first ever management position. And so another thing that happens when people are learning together, being vulnerable together, is that they become incredibly tight as a team. Because standing up on stage, standing up to present, standing up to share any form of information is a vulnerable space to be in. You know, we think it's about just delivering content, but actually it's, are these people going to like me? Is it fair that I'm standing on this stage? What do people think of me? Am I going to get it right? Am I going to get it wrong? Like, what if I forget? What if I feel faint? What if what happens when I was 10 years old and someone laughed at me on stage happens again? Our bodies go into that process all over again very, very quickly. So we talk through that entire process, with techniques, etc., of how to mitigate the nerves. The nerves are never going to go away. Sorry. It's the first thing I say is that I can't get rid of nerves. I can help you work with them. But the thing about meetings and engagements with your seniors is the more you step into your power, the more likely you are to get onto their level, which sounds like a weird thing to say, but when you're in conversation with more senior people, you are going to get more senior work. You're going to get noticed. It is absolutely about personal brand. And from an organizational perspective, you are most likely to be noticed when you are doing a presentation to a large group.
Yeah, extremely interesting. And I agree with what you're saying in terms of, like you in a company, like you can, almost like in a large business, you can go and, I mean, I think the standard is to go unnoticed, right? So working with people and helping them see how they can leverage. And when you say stepping into a power, I guess that's, they feel confident. Could be like a specific skill set that they have to bring to the table. So the personal development probably comes from that, when do you feel, confident? And then to really, as you said, you'll never feel fully at ease and comfortable in the position of delivering a message. And if anything, it puts a magnifying glass on everything that you find fault with yourself, because now you're exposed.
Yeah.
And it's just really going through those moments, what makes you overcome them, get familiarized with the feeling, and then hopefully start reaping the rewards of, putting yourself out there and exposing yourself.
Completely. One of the delegates I once worked with, she was, her basic thing to me was, I just do my work and I try not to be noticed. And a couple of weeks ago, I bumped into her at Woolworths, as one does, and she basically said to me, I volunteered at every single talk and meeting we go to, I volunteered to be the spokesperson now, which is a complete change to how she was. So from a culture perspective, you end up with people being more engaged because they feel more confident to speak up. That team in particular, they had a real challenge with their boss because they felt that the briefs that she gave them for their presentations weren't clear enough. And so because I do individual coaching, and my contract with the team is that if I spot a pattern, I will speak to the organization. If I don't spot a pattern, then that's fine. But which is the same for most coaches who are working with a group. And so I spotted the pattern of people don't feel that they're being briefed properly. And so we've now put something in place where the first slide of every single presentation that team does is the briefing slide. So it's never going to get shown properly, but they can always refer back to, this is the brief that I received, and is everything aligned to that brief? Which also means that the boss can't change their mind halfway through unless they're communicating that properly, which is possible, of course. But then everyone knows that there's been a change as opposed to it being an uncertain thing.
Yeah, I hear you. And that also reminded me, I work with a client where they do monthly stand-ups, and what they ask is that one team member from each team needs to give an update of what happened in the past month. And I think what it does for that company is that it can be the manager, but then they should also kind of rotate in the team who is the one that speaks. And I think what it does for that company is that everybody's kind of used to addressing the full stamp compliment. I mean, there's 60 employees, so it's doable, right, on a monthly kind of setup in person. But what it does is that I think it definitely brings a degree of togetherness. And then because I have, stand up and kind of spoke to everybody, then it's informal interactions in between people. It's everybody's part of the one thing. And I do think it is that exactly that action of just standing up and speaking to everybody.
Totally.
It's quite amazing. I mean, it obviously became like a ritual for this company, a rhythm, but it has this kind of effect of it's not only sharing information. If anything, it's not really about the technical information that is being shared. It's just really this togetherness moment and addressing everybody in the same room.
Yeah.
And Carryn, I'd love to hear from you in terms of how do you tailor presentation trainings to suit different kind of types of teams and cultures, if there's methods that work better in specific environments.
Sure, absolutely. So I every now and then I get really nervous, like on session 1 or session 2, I get very nervous. Maybe this is the one that's where it's not going to work, and I have to remind myself to trust my process and to give it some time. So the main thing is that I hear from the person, obviously, who's bringing me in, what is it that they are looking for? And what's interesting is often what they are looking for, and then what the delegates who are on the course, and a lot of the time the person who's bringing me in is not on the course, what they are looking for and what the delegates are looking for are often two different things, because people are feeling different things, right? So what we end up doing is bringing in, so let me maybe start again. I work with a lot of neurolinguistics, right? So neurolinguistic programming is obviously the study of language and how it impacts our brains. And so what I often do is, knowing the outcomes that the organization looks for, is I make sure that I use the language of that in my training. So if an outcome that we're looking for is, guys, we need to be focusing ourselves on impact, not information, then I use that language quite regularly, right? If the organization is more speaking about, hey, we need to speak more about storytelling, then I will emphasize storytelling throughout the process. The storytelling module is definitely my favorite one to deliver, and definitely the one that has the most impact, because we don't just talk about the fact that stories are important in business, but actually about how everything in our lives is around stories, right? So what is the story I tell myself about what it means to stand up in front of people? Right? What is the story I tell myself about when I'm going to meet with that boss? What does it mean? So I just adapt what the focus is for each, basically for each group. And then naturally, if people have more or less time, we make adaptations to things. I've recently delivered work to 8 kind of junior executives, which was the full program. And then there were 8 more senior executives, 9 more senior executives, and they had a shortened session. So we had very intense content for an hour, and then 1 hour of practice and delivery, because in all of the sessions, everyone delivers, and either I or another one of the delegates gives specific actionable feedback, so that it is tailored for the workplace. All the presentations are generally workplace presentations, so we're not, no one's talking about my weekend or anything like that, unless, of course, they choose to. But I don't really want people to do more work. I just want to do the work that they are currently doing in a more efficient, effective, confident way.
Okay, so then you mentioned, I'd love to understand a little bit more. You mentioned this storytelling framework, and there's other ones. Maybe I'd love to hear a bit more from that.
Sure. So in the business world, it's difficult to bring in a story about on Tuesday, I went for a walk and I was walking my dog and I had this experience and that experience. Stories are what connect us, and stories are what make people feel like they are part of things. So I use the different techniques that we use are finding out where we are and where we're going to, and what is the change in between. And that is the story, right? The change point is the story. That's in the business world. That is, when people put up a big slide that has got, so many numbers on it, and they look at it and they're like, obviously, if you look at the slide, you can see this and this and this. Now, firstly, it's not obvious. And if I've never seen that slide before, within 2 seconds, I've switched off because it's too much information for me. But if you put up a visual of the story and the change that you're trying to show me, that is far more impactful. Yes, it's maybe a little bit more work, but it is far more impactful and memorable. Then if we're going to bring in story or intention, remember some people, they're like, I don't want to talk about myself. You don't have to talk about yourself. You can talk about someone else's experience that is aligned to the message you want people to remember. You can speak about a product. You can speak about an event. There's a whole lot of stuff. And I'll probably get killed for saying this, but ChatGPT is phenomenal for that. Because if I type in, hi, ChatGPT, please, because you have to be polite to ChatGPT, please find a fairly unknown story about a person who does this, this, and this with this, this, and this outcome. And they'll tell you something historical, which I recommend Googling to double check that it is actually accurate. But finding the story that is meaningful, that feels embodied for you, is crucial. Now, obviously, in an organization, people often like to hear personal stories about how you got there, which is another way of doing that. Another thing to bear in mind is that it doesn't have to be about a person. It can be about a product. So a product has a life cycle too. And we can always turn anything into a story. Also, really good if people go, right, and let me use one that I use often to start, which is that on the 3rd of May, 1981, my life changed. Nothing has been the same since then. And while, yes, in some ways it made life more tricky, it's the best. The 3rd of May, 1981 is the day that influenced more than anything else I can imagine. And I use that technique, and then I don't tell them what happened, because that's showing
what happened.
I don't know what happened, because it's showing that, okay, now your dopamine's up, your dopamine's up, and you're interested and you're sparking, and now people are listening and waiting for the news of what happened on the 3rd of May, 1981. And now I can start talking about almost anything else, and people are still waiting and holding their breath. And then at the end, 10 minutes later, I can say, so my brother's birthday, which I celebrate every year on the 3rd of May, 1981, 3rd of May, is the day that changed things forever. Now, obviously, I'm not going to share that story unless it's relevant, et cetera, et cetera. But there are different techniques you can use to make stories hold people's attention. Wrapping with a story, ending with a story, holding open loops. I don't really go into the technical story arcs because, getting too technical doesn't help. But some of the techniques include things like actually bringing in dialogue. So I turned to my brother and I said, hey, what do you think of this? And his response was, dude, you never want to do that ever again in your life. So I'm showing you rather than telling you what you should or should not do.
I find this very interesting because it's almost like I love to hear from you your thoughts in terms of what's the connection between humans and stories. Why are we so captivated? What is with the psychology in terms of how they work? And also, I love to hear from you because I'm pretty sure this workshop that you do and the product that you have designed has to do with like acquiring this knowledge and maybe put it into practice. So if you can tell me about those two things.
Sure, no problem. So, stories are the way our history has been shared. Nothing exists without us having a story around it. And if I say to you, Rose, let me tell you a story, your whole being kind of relaxes into storytelling mode. I'm here to listen. I'm here to receive. Most people have the privilege of having their parents read to them at night or telling them stories around a campfire. So we are, as humans, we are storied people, firstly. Then there's the concept of the stories I tell myself about. As an example here, the diamond company De Beers made up the story that an engagement ring must be a diamond and it must be worth 3 months worth of salary. Now, that is a story. Whether you choose to believe it or not is entirely up to you. But De Beers does their marketing. It's marketing and sales, right? And if we think about humans, we're more likely to purchase something if we feel connected to it. And we're more likely to feel connected to it if we have a story about it, if we have a belief system about it. Why does someone buy Apple products? Because they buy into the story. Now, Apple or Dell may be exactly the same technically, but I'm buying an Apple because. Right? So our belief systems and emotions are very orientated around the stories we tell ourselves.
And I love what you said, because probably also from your background, I relate to that, this fact that it takes us to that very childhood space of a parent telling a story to a kid. That's kind of like the picture of childhood, and it probably brings feelings of feeling nurtured. It's a warm feeling. It's that care of a parent and that moment of connection. So I guess that is also that kind of maybe playing in some sort of unconscious the moment we hear stories. And then exactly what you said, this thing around we only know history because of stories being told. And that saying that goes like, only winners write the
Tell the
story.
stories, right? Yeah.
That's crazy thought, because I feel like also our human kind of condition, we also chunk story, like we know kind of well what happened the last 100 years, because it's kind of like the story that we learn at school. And you probably know a localized story of your region, and then a little bit of like the global story. But and then I guess you also have like ancient story and basics, but obviously so much has been lost. But the only resource that we have to kind of have an idea and understand what happened, and usually understanding the past, it means that we know how to operate in the future and operate in the present and operate in the future. So I think it might also work, that psychology of why we pay attention to stories so much is because we know there's learnings that are going to help us going forward, type of thing.
Absolutely. So the statement that I work mainly in the story world is that people are looking for insight and impact rather than information, right? And your best way of sharing insight and impact is through a story. And if one person has had that experience, you tell the story of the one person. Because in a world with 8 billion people, if one person has had that experience, I promise you other people have had that experience too. And remember, your story doesn't have to be true to be believable. So also, if we pull this back to HR and to organizational culture, what is the story the business tells itself about what the culture is? What is the real story of what the culture is? What is the story of the external marketing world that gets told? And all of this needs to be presented in a way that is understandable, that is, where people get it, where the person sharing the story is confident, etc. Now, it's very, very seldom that we're sharing news in our organization that we don't know, that we actually don't like. Most people could stand up and speak about what their job is about for 45 minutes very easily. And then the moment it's got the word presentation to it, or there's an outcome, then those nerves kick up again. So how do we take the idea of, I can actually just talk about this and feel calm and confident and like I'm having a conversation, and move that into the big match temperament is what I call it. Well, many people call it that. The BMT of, now I'm standing up in front of people. So it's how do we take the story from standing around a campfire to I'm standing in front of a group of people who are important, where the outcome of the story actually means something.
I hear you. And going back to that impact that you want to make, because it all comes back to, some people may say, look, I'm not interested. Like, I don't want, I'm an introvert. I don't want my story to be heard. I don't want to be good at it. But who doesn't in life want to grow? So this is like a tool, a presentation tool in terms of like what your internal world, how do you actually put it out there in a way that it's going to create an impact and it's going to kind of better your life.
Yeah.
The only thing I must say, I find, and I go back to the TEDx stories that I've listened to, and people that are just like very good with presentation, and also in the podcast world, you actually get a lot of people that are obviously exercising the skill set, and sometimes it can feel put on, and I guess it might have to do with, like you have to stay true to your nature, but at the same time you do want to draw attention. And so it's an interesting one, and I take that's a little bit of the path that you walk with people in terms of like you
Of
have to.
course. There's a difference, once something becomes a performance, it's different to being a presentation. So a performance is remembered, it's rehearsed, it's you know exactly what you're doing, where and when you're doing it. And my experience of the TED and TEDx world, and those speakers are remarkable, but they have rehearsed properly for 2 to 3 months beforehand. They know those talks off by heart. They know what movements they're making. Remember, it's also designed for camera. So the audience, in the venue is important, but that the thing that's going to live on is your camera. So a lot of those talks are designed for camera. They're designed to be a performance, and it's very different to next week Tuesday. Please, can you just give us some feedback on XYZ report that you did? That's not a performance. That's standing up and sharing information. So. The thing with TED and TEDx is that the authenticity is incredibly important, which is why the majority of them start with a story around what makes that person passionate about what they have done, right? There's no formula, but there is that passion for the idea that they have needs to come through. And it's impossible to do that level of presentation or performance every single time. But having the ability to say, okay, I need to take this information and make it digestible, interesting, relevant, and usable in the next week, that is a different skill to giving a TEDx talk.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. That podcast that I was listening to was mentioning that when you say performance now and it's rehearsed, and what you're saying, the movements that you're making differently to the purpose of maybe workplace or life in general, that it's more of an improv because you don't know the prompts are going to be from, and then you have to. So they were actually giving like resources in terms of how to just better that improv. So the prompts, like, the typical when you just go into the office, hi, how are you? That how are you? It's like such a daunting question at the end of the day. It's a lighthearted question, but you go like every day you're going to be saying fine and you know.
Thank you.
As opposed to saying something like, what's fun this week? Like that's a different question that can get someone going, or what has been the highlight of your week, and then like using these little tiny resources that can really make a difference of how someone perceives you, which in turn is going to, change the way you perceive your world and enhance your experience in the world. The other thing they were mentioning, which I thought was really insightful, was that there's this study that proves that people with hand gestures, and that the more space they take up with the hand gestures, have a higher rate of being liked. And there was something related to like also like kind of primitive brain in terms of like showing particularly your hands and the palm of your hands. If you're showing that, you're like a friend, because if I am a little bit afraid of you or something, it's the neck area, and also like like withholding and staying kind of close. So yeah, I find all of that really fascinating. I'd love to close off with you telling me about the particular workshop that you developed, and maybe a bit of a success story around once you deployed, what has been those changes that you've seen.
Sure, no problem. So the course that I designed, which I designed in 2021, and I sold it before I designed it, which is great because you get to create while it's very clear what people need. So it's called Beyond Presentations, and I have a six session process where we start off with setup of myself, my space, my content. Go into structure, go into stories, go into slides and visuals, go into stagecraft, which is more about the performance and those open hand movements and gestures and alignment. I'm more concerned about alignment than the number of things. And then the final session is around integration. And the way that works is that there's content in between. We speak about content. We deep dive into each of those areas, very much aligned to what that group needs and wants. I joked with someone, I said, I almost follow like a Montessori system where the way that the group goes is the way that we go, and making sure that the basics are there, but their interest is held. And then each within those 6 sessions, I also do 2 individual coaching sessions for people, because often people want to talk about like their memories of speaking up the first time. You know, I was fortunate in that I saw both my parents presented and spoke a lot. I watched them prepare. I watched them speak in front of groups. That was part of who they were. But a lot of people don't have that. So, you know, what are their memories of that? And we go into that into a little bit, and I use a lot of my integral coaching from UCT in that. And I suppose, most of the courses that I've done, generally people come back with feedback even a year or 2 later that they still use the information and it changed the way that they approach. But one of the things that I do is in some groups, and it depends on what the outcomes are that they're looking for, is I teach the feedback process that we use in the TEDx world, right? So TEDx is scary and it's hectic. So you don't want to say to people, oh, don't do this and don't move your arm here and don't do this, because, you know, when we mention something, it gets focused on. So we work with the process where, hey, I noticed that when you stood really still and spoke super clearly and focused, that your audience was very, very captivated. So I'd love to see more of that. So we work on that, seeing more of the good rather than less of the bad. And I teach that technique. And what happened with this particular group, it was a group of 12. It was fairly junior people, but this group of 12 ended up getting on so well with each other that their agreement became that in every person's presentation, 2 people would be the feedback givers and go afterwards and give them feedback in the technique. That this is what I noticed about these 3 bosses who were in the room and when they responded better to your presenting versus not. So those kinds of things end up building a team of people who can communicate well with each other, who are comfortable being open, comfortable giving feedback. It's not easy to give feedback. In some cases, they struggled with the feedback more than they did with the actual presentation. But that is one of the areas. In another organization that I have worked with, they've shifted from having lots and lots of meetings to having short, sharp presentations as opposed to the longer. They don't do 1-hour meetings anymore. They now do 45-minute meetings with a very specific structure of this much presentation, this much Q&A. So it's far better designed to be well timed, well respectful of time, and also making sure that people prepare properly for those presentations. So I call it beyond presentations because it truly is not about the presenting, it's about the person and how they communicate more than anything else.
I hear you. I really love what you do. I feel like the world that we work in, you know, like professional world, workplace type of setup and enhancement of that, what you have to offer, it's a very creative way of looking at, you know, what's happening and provide creative solutions that probably have like very defined outcomes in terms of like you can see the betterment, right? And then to finish off, I'd love to understand what you did mention it before, but a little bit of that client need again in terms of when the need becomes quite like, okay, this is a good client for me. I'd love to understand that.
Sure. So for most of the clients that I generally work with, what they do is they use presentation or specific meetings to get ideas across so that people can make decisions. That's one side of things. So how do we help junior people get ideas across in a better way so that better decisions can be made more quickly and more effectively? So the presentation is not boring, doesn't wind off in different directions, and the person feels comfortable and confident delivering that. That's the first thing. Another side of things that I work with are sales teams. How do sales teams learn how to tell stories better to get people to understand and feel the benefit of the product that they are doing? So those are the main areas. And then naturally I'm called in when people say, oh, I've got this person, she's really good. She panics so much about delivering this content that she actually can't speak up. So then it's helping that person just practice the smallest things. You know, nothing needs to be impromptu. So if you know you're going into a meeting, plan to ask one question. If you're that nervous, just plan to ask one question. Because all you need is your voice in the room, and you need to practice it once, and then practice it twice, and then practice it the next time. So those are the main reasons that I'm brought in, is to help people get their ideas across in a better, more confident way so that decisions can be made more easily. to help sales teams to make sure that those sales teams know how to storytell in a way that gets people to purchase products, obviously. And then for individuals, it's about helping them become more confident in their speaking and in their communication generally.
I love that. Thank
Thanks,
you so
Rose.
much, Carryn. It was really
You're
nice
welcome.
to see this. As I said, very kind of fresh and original. And
Thank you.
yeah, I think it's so valuable for anybody that has,
Thank
those
you.
industry situations that you identified, to really take advantage of what you have to offer.
Awesome. Thanks. Lovely to chat. And thank you for the work that you do, sharing all the HR, needs into the world. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Carryn. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.